I had never ridden the old commuter train that ran only at night before. It looked ordinary from the outside, but when I boarded the last car, I felt something strange. The air was too cold, and the light from the bulbs flickered with an alarming irregularity. The car was almost empty, except for me and an elderly woman in a dark coat sitting in the far corner. She was looking out the window, but her eyes were fixed somewhere inside the car, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The train started moving, and immediately a quiet hissing sound could be heard from under the floor. These weren't the usual mechanical sounds. They sounded almost like whispers, as if someone was talking to the carriage. I tried to get up to approach the woman, but as soon as I took a step, the doors to the other cars vanished. I realized the carriage was as if alive. The corridor lengthened and curved, and the windows showed a landscape that shouldn't have been there. A dense forest with black, twisted trees and a fog that glowed with a dim light. Suddenly, I heard a quiet laugh, first barely audible, then clearly, right behind my shoulder. The woman slowly turned to me and whispered, "You've gone too far. Now the train decide whether to leave you here or not." I felt the floor beneath my feet give way slightly, and my heart stopped for a second. At that moment, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, faceless, with long arms reaching towards my carriage. The train accelerated sharply, and I felt the air outside trying to suck me in. I screamed, but the screams didn't leave the car. They became part of the whisper coming from the floor. And then the train fell silent. The windows no longer showed the forest, only a semi-darkness in which I could make out the silhouettes of other passengers. They were all motionless, as if waiting for something. The woman looked at me again and said, "They know you're watching, and now they're waiting for your choice." I turned to the door, but it had disappeared, and when I took another step forward, a sound like 1,000 tiny locks opening simultaneously echoed around me. I froze, realizing that the train wasn't just moving on rails, but according to some rules I didn't understand. And then I heard a whisper right in my ear, "Your decision will change everything, or you will remain here forever." And it was at that moment I realized that the way home might not be what I had imagined. But what would happen next, I still didn't know. I froze in place. Listening to the whisper, it no longer sounded just like a noise, but like thoughts invading my head directly. Choose the door, or stay forever. The carriage began to move again, but not on rails. It was as if it was sliding through the air, through the darkness. The silhouettes of the other passengers began to move. They didn't walk, they just appeared before me, and their faces were empty, like mirrors without reflections. I realized these were the souls of those who had once stayed on the train forever. The woman in the dark coat approached me again. This time, her eyes glowed with a strange green light. She held out her hand and said, "You can choose one door, but be careful. Each one leads to a world from which you can never return." The carriage turned sharply, and 3 doors appeared before me. Each was different. A door with strange symbols carved into it, from which cold mist seeped. A wooden door, old, with deep cracks, from behind which came the quiet crying of a child. A metal door with rusty rivets, from behind which laughter could be heard. Joyful but terrible, as if someone was celebrating another's pain. I felt the faceless figures slowly approaching from the other end of the car, and the whisper grew louder. "Choose, or stay forever." My hands were trembling. I didn't know which door was safe and which was a trap. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would leap out of my chest. And suddenly the train halted. The entire car plunged into a silence, so thick I could hear my fingers trembling. The woman leaned close to me and whispered, "Time is running out." I took a step towards one of the doors, and everything around me began to disappear. The carriage, the passengers, the whisper. Only I and that door remained. I raised my hand to open it, and at that very moment, everything cut off. When I raised my hand to the door, the entire carriage vanished. I found myself in a long corridor, lit by a dim, flickering light. Every door along the sides was closed, and from behind each one came a whisper, each different, as if each voice belonged to a separate personality, lost in this train. I moved forward, and the corridor began to distort, the walls bent, the ceiling lowered, and the floor seemed to flow beneath my feet, as if the carriage was a living creature. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, fast, heavy, approaching steps, and I knew the faceless figure was following me. I tried to open the nearest door. It gave way with difficulty, and I burst into a room filled with clocks. They were all ticking, but their hands moved in different directions, sometimes backward. On the floor lay photographs of people. I saw familiar faces, my own, the faces of friends I had already lost in the carriage. They were all half-transparent like ghosts, and panic was frozen on their faces. The whisper became a scream. "Time's up. Time has stopped forever." I ran to the center of the room and noticed another door. Huge, black, with carved strange symbols that glowed with a bloody light. It seemed to beckon me. I felt the faceless figure approach almost right up to me, and for a second, the world around me froze. I pulled on the door handle, and suddenly found myself on the platform of an abandoned station. the very one from which the train had once departed. Darkness surrounded me, but in the distance I heard the sound of train wheels, and it was getting closer. And then I saw in the window of the driver's cabin, not a person, but a silhouette that looked like me. It raised its hand and waved at me, as if inviting me to board. I stood unable to move, understanding that the train was about to start moving again, and at that moment, the whisper sounded right in my ear again. You will return, only if you can choose correctly, or you will stay with us forever. I realized the true nightmare was only beginning. Standing on a platform, I heard the approaching clatter of the train wheels, growing louder and louder. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed all the passengers of the empty city could hear it. I understood that the door to the driver's cabin was the only way, but fear paralyzed every muscle. And then the train stopped right in front of me. Its doors opened, and figures emerged from inside. Those I'd seen in the corridor. The ghostly silhouettes of friends and strangers with empty eyes. They stood in silence, as if assessing me, and every whisper in the carriage now merged into one voice. Choose correctly, or stay forever. I took a step forward. The cabin looked familiar, like an ordinary train, but inside, instead of instruments, there was a strange red light and bones scattered on the floor. On the driver's lever sat a shadow that resembled me, but with a disfigured face and eyes that glowed with a cold fire. You must come with us, said the silhouette, its voice sounding simultaneously like mine and someone else's. But if you turn back, the carriage will take you forever. I froze, realizing that any movement was a risk. At that moment, another door lit up on the platform, a black one with copper runes. It appeared out of thin air, like a portal. The whisper repeated, "In this door lies your chance, or your end." I stepped towards it, and then the train jerked forward, as if carrying me through space and time. I felt the air around me compress, and the walls of the cabin began to move, bend, emitting a howl like 1,000 simultaneous screams. Suddenly, I found myself on a half-empty station. There was no train, no people, no platform around, only darkness, and in it, tiny lights that moved like eyes. They were staring right at me. And I understood. The train would never stop, the doors would always appear, and the whisper would follow me forever. I stood in the darkness, surrounded by hundreds of tiny lights that now seemed almost like living beings. They trembled, moved towards me, and it seemed each one was whispering my name. I felt a cold touch on my back, and turning around, I saw long, faceless arms reaching for my chest. Suddenly, the air around me swirled like a vortex, and I was back in the carriage. But it wasn't the same carriage I'd seen before. The walls were covered in writings resembling ancient runes, and the floor was like a mirror, reflecting not me, but my fears, the faces of friends I had lost, and my own screams. And then I heard the voice of the woman I recognized immediately. It was that elderly passenger, but her eyes now burned with a red fire, and her arms stretched towards the ceiling, as if pulling something invisible. She said, "Every choice leads to consequences, and only one path leads to freedom, but you won't know which until you take the step." I looked at the doors around me. There were countless ones, each breathed its own darkness, and through each, I heard different sounds. Screams, laughter, crying, quiet whispers. I wanted to scream, but the sound of my voice dissolved in the air. I stepped towards one of the doors, and suddenly felt the world around me disappearing. I found myself on a platform that looked exactly like the one where the train had started, only there was no light, no shadows on the station, just absolute darkness from which a whisper came. "You have returned, but no one said the choice would be yours." And when I listened, I heard another sound. A different train was approaching, but its cabin wasn't like an ordinary one. It glowed with a green radiance, and figures flickered in the window that resembled no one I had ever seen before. I realized at this time, the train wasn't just waiting for me. It was waiting for everyone who had ever tried to leave. And then I understood the terrible truth. I didn't know if there was a way back. I stood on the platform, feeling the cold squeezing every cell of my body. The new train was approaching with a dull roar that resonated inside me. There was nothing around but black fog, and every spark of light in the distance seemed alive. When the train stopped, the doors swung open, and inside wasn't a familiar cabin, but a tunnel stretching into infinity. Through it, I could see the silhouettes of people, but their movements were wrong. They walked sideways, leaned at strange angles, and their eyes glowed with a pale light, as if their souls were held by something inhuman. I heard the familiar whisper, "You have returned, but time flows differently here. Every step could cost you an eternity." The woman with red eyes appeared beside me. She reached out to me. "You can choose the train, but remember, one leads to freedom, the others to eternal darkness. Decide quickly." I looked back and saw 3 trains standing on parallel tracks. A black one with a metallic gleam, from which came both screams and laughter simultaneously. A white one, almost transparent, in whose window my own fears were reflected. A green one, glowing from within, in which the faces of those I had lost flickered. At that moment, the figures on the platform began to whisper, "Choose or stay forever." I took a step forward, and one of the carriage doors opened. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. Suddenly, the train jerked forward, and I felt the air around me swirl, and the floor beneath my feet disappeared. And then I saw the window of the cabin. There, instead of a driver, sat I myself. My hand rose and waved at me. I understood the horrible truth. The train wasn't just transportation. It was a trap for those who dared to take a step. And now, I wasn't just a passenger. I was becoming a part of it forever. And as soon as I took the next step, everything around me dissolved into darkness, leaving only one sensation: that this was only the beginning. I found myself in complete darkness. No platform, no trains. Only endless darkness and a faint, barely audible whisper. "You have returned, and now they know." I felt cold air behind my back. Someone or something was following me, invisible, but with every step, its presence felt denser. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared before me. Tall, thin, with an empty face. Only its eyes glowed with a pale blue light. It reached out its hand, and I felt the reality around me begin to bend. The walls of air trembled, and the floor disappeared beneath my feet. I ran, not knowing where, hearing the whispers of all those who had disappeared on the train before. Their voices merged into one terrible echo. No one leaves, no one. Suddenly, I saw a small light in the distance, a tiny door hanging in the air. Like a portal, my heart froze, but before I could step towards it, the train emerged from the darkness. Huge, with windows in which hundreds of faces flickered. They looked at me and simultaneously smiled and screamed. I understood a terrible thing. The doors, the train, all these whispers, it was a trap that never lets go. And every time someone thinks they found a way out, the train waits for them again, moving them between reality and nightmare. I took a step towards the door, and everything went dark before my eyes. I heard the familiar voice of the woman with red eyes. "You think you can choose, but the choice has already been made." And then I understood. The train isn't just a place. It's a living being that feeds on fear. It watches, studies you, and always leaves a path open only so you think you're free. And when I finally approached the door, I heard from afar the same rumble of wheels. But it wasn't one train. There were infinitely many of them, and each one was rushing straight towards me. I froze, and I realized the story is only beginning. When I stood before the endless trains, they began to move simultaneously. Every carriage creaked and howled like a living creature. I felt the vibration under my feet, transmitting not just sound, but fear that seemed to be sucked into me. Suddenly, the lights around began to form the silhouettes of people I had once seen on the platform. But they moved incorrectly, twisting their bodies at impossible angles. Their voices merged into one. "They're coming for you. No one leaves." I tried to choose a door and jump, but the darkness beneath my feet suddenly opened like a maw, and I felt something invisible grab my legs. I tried to scream, but the sound of my words dissolved in the air. Then I heard the voice of the woman with red eyes again. "Every train leads to where the fear is strongest, and only those who stop being afraid can leave." I understood the terrible truth. This train is alive. It reads my thoughts, studies my fears. It knows all my weaknesses. Every step I take, every choice, is not just a choice of route, but a game of survival. And when I looked up again, all the doors opened simultaneously. Inside each, I saw different worlds. One was covered in fire and screams. Another was flooded with water and crying silhouettes. A third, a void, endless darkness that seemed to beckon me. And then the whisper turned into a scream. "Choose or stay forever." I took a step towards one of the doors, and the world around me dissolved again. But now I heard a new sound, not the screech of wheels, but a quiet laugh coming from the train itself. And it said, "This is only the beginning, and your story will never end." I stepped through the door, and suddenly the world around me changed. I found myself in a huge, dark station where only rare lamps glowed, trembling like pulsating eyes. But it wasn't an ordinary station. The tracks went nowhere, and it seemed the rails could bend and tear in midair. The shadows of the passengers I had seen before stood in lines for every train. Their faces were empty, without emotion, but their eyes glowed with despair and fear. They turned to me and whispered, "You're here again. You're next." I ran to the nearest train, but the platforms under my feet began to disappear, as if the ground was dissolving beneath me. And I fell into darkness, screaming, but the sound dissolved, leaving only cold and emptiness. And then I heard the familiar voice of the woman with red eyes again. "The train doesn't let go. And if you think you can run away, think again." I looked back and saw that the countless doors and trains had started moving on their own. They writhed, collided, disappeared, and reappeared. Each one beckoned, promising salvation, but I understood it was a trap. And then I understood the terrible truth. This train isn't just a place. It lives, thinks, and feeds on the fear of those who dare to enter. And now it's watching me, studying my every step and preparing the next test. I froze, realizing I had no choice. The train is waiting for me, and the doors continue to open, as if calling me deeper into its endless darkness. And then I heard a quiet but distinct whisper right in my ear. Welcome back. The game begins again. I stood on the platform, surrounded by countless train carriages, and felt the tension reach its limit. Every train trembled, as if alive, and I understood. They weren't just waiting for a passenger. They were waiting for me. The whisper was now loud, almost a scream. Your choice will decide everything, or you will stay forever. I took a step towards the nearest door. It opened with difficulty, and I saw a tunnel full of bright light that seemed like salvation. Inside, voices could be heard, but not frightening ones. They were soothing, as if whispering, "Come almost free." But when I stepped inside, I felt resistance. Invisible hands grabbed my shoulders. My heart raced. My breath caught. The shadows of past passengers surrounded me, their empty eyes looking right through me. I felt a strange jolt and understood. The train isn't letting go. It's preparing the final test. Inside the tunnel, I saw 3 silhouettes. One resembled me, another the woman with red eyes, the third, that faceless figure that had been pursuing me from the very beginning. And then I heard a voice that sounded simultaneously like mine and someone else's. Choose, or disappear forever. But remember, your choice is not final. I took a step towards one of the silhouettes. The world around me shuddered, the light flickered, and I found myself on the border between what could be freedom and what could be eternal nightmare. I understood one thing. The end is near, but who will win? Me or the train remains unknown. And as I stood, preparing to take the last step, the whisper sounded right in my ear again. Did you think it was over? This is only the beginning of the last journey. I took a step forward, and the light from the tunnel blinded me sharply. Everything spun around, and I felt I was losing control of my body. The silhouettes before me began to move, not like people, but like shadows that knew every fear of mine. The woman with red eyes approached and whispered, "You must make a choice. One path leads to freedom, the other to eternity." I looked at the 3 silhouettes, my double, the faceless shadow, and the one that seemed to be the embodiment of the train. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stepped towards the double, and the world around me changed again. The platform disappeared, the train began to accelerate, and I felt the air compress around me, as if the train itself was trying to swallow me. And then I saw something incredible. In the distance, through the flickering light of the tunnel, a door appeared. It wasn't part of the carriage. It hung in the void, glowing quietly and beckoning me. I understood. This might be my only chance. But before I could approach it, the darkness shuddered, and the faceless figure reached out its hand to me, cold as ice, as if trying to pull me back. The voices whispered simultaneously, "Choose." Too late. I took the last step towards the door, and at that moment, the whole world froze. I heard only one whisper that penetrated directly into my consciousness. "If you enter, there is no way back. But if you don't, the train will take you forever." I reached my hand towards the door, and at that moment, everything around me dissolved into darkness again. I froze before the glowing door, feeling the cold hands of the faceless shadow gripping my shoulder. The world around me trembled, as if the train was breathing, preparing to swallow me. My heart was beating so hard it seemed the sound was tearing through the darkness. The woman with red eyes stepped forward, her voice simultaneously close and alien. "You see the exit, but the path to it is full of trials. One wrong step, and it will all be over." I took a step forward and suddenly found myself in a corridor that hadn't existed before. The walls curved, the floor breathed under my feet, and the reflections in the glass surfaces didn't mimic my movements. They laughed, leaned over, tried to stop me. I heard the screams of everyone who had ever tried to leave. They begged me not to go further, but their words dissolved into silence. At the end of the corridor, the door glowed brightest. I understood this was the final test. The train had been watching my every decision, and now I needed to choose. Enter the light or stay here, where the darkness could swallow me forever. I stepped closer, and then I heard a quiet but confident whisper right in my ear. "Remember, everything you see is only the beginning. When you think the end is near, the train will come for you again." My hand touched the door. The light blinded me, and I felt reality tremble, as if I was standing on the brink between freedom and eternity. I stepped inside, and at that moment, everything around me dissolved into a blinding light, leaving only one sensation. The story isn't over yet. I found myself in a blinding light, but instead of freedom, I felt myself dissolving into it. My whole body felt simultaneously heavy and light. The air vibrated, the whispers of past passengers merged into one voice. "Welcome to where no one returns." My double appeared before me. He stood with the same eyes as mine, but they were empty, cold. He raised his hand and said, "You thought you were choosing the path, but the path chooses you." I understood that the train wasn't just a trap. It was alive, it studied fear, it fed on decisions. And now my freedom depended not on choosing a door, but on whether I could cross the boundaries of my own fear. And suddenly, the darkness around me tightened, and I felt the train returning. Its wheels rolled not on rails, but on air, emitting a roar that penetrated directly into my head, mixing reality with nightmare. The woman with red eyes appeared beside me and whispered, "This is your last chance, but remember, even if you manage to choose, it's not the end." I took a step forward, and the door in front of me began to close. The light weakened, the darkness advanced, and the whispers grew louder. I reached out my hand and felt invisible forces pulling me back. At that moment, I heard the screech of the train wheels that would never stop. It was approaching to take me again, and I understood. The end is near, but the story isn't over yet. I stood before the door, the light gradually fading, the darkness from all corners pulling me back. My heart was pounding in a frantic rhythm. My breath caught, and the whispers of the passengers around me became almost unbearable. "You're taking too long to choose, stop." Suddenly, the figure of my double stepped forward. His eyes were empty, but in them, I saw something strange, awareness, fear, and a faint spark of life. He reached out his hand, and I understood that this wasn't just a reflection, but a part of me that had always remained behind. The woman with red eyes stepped aside and whispered, "You can enter or stay, but remember, everything you choose is not the end. Even freedom is a trap." I took a deep breath and stepped inside the door. The light enveloped me, and I expected to see salvation. But instead, I found myself in another train. It was empty, quiet, but the wheels emitted a roar like a living heart. On the seats lay photographs of all the passengers I'd seen before, and on each was today's date. I realized the terrible truth. The train never lets go. It wasn't just alive. It chose those who would be part of its endless story. But then I saw a window in which the face of the faceless figure flashed. It was looking directly at me and smiling. And then I understood. The story never ends as long as someone dares to enter. I sat down in a seat, the doors closed behind me, and the train started moving again, but now I knew. I wasn't just a passenger, I was part of the train, and every new step, every new fear was now my path. And somewhere deep in the carriage, in the reflection of a mirror, I saw my face, but now with the red eyes of the woman, with a quiet whisper. "Welcome to eternity." The story is complete, but the world of the night train continues to live.